Welcome back to another side quest VII. Back with me is Wes Shantz. Great to see you again, Wes. How are you doing today?
Not too bad. Yeah, it's a snowy day here and the day before President's Day as we're recording, so I've got a day off tomorrow. I know you've got to work, but um, it's hopefully a restful little conversation, a little break for you here. Catching up on Final Fantasy VIII.
Absolutely. No, it's one of my favorite parts of the day, the weekend, and the week. Indeed, and hopefully you get a chance to catch up on some playing tomorrow, prior to our next conversation. Well,
Yes.
just before we jump in, I wanted to thank one of the listeners for leaving a YouTube comment and saying that this was like a hidden gem at the end of a side quest, and to encourage other listeners while listening along to give their feedback. Do I say and too much? I know the answer is yes. I've heard all of these. It's terrible. We need a video of it. But anytime any sort of comments like those, we always like to see because even the smallest flame can keep the kindling flickering. But to that point, obviously, if somebody is listening to this recording, they have found this YouTube channel and like, subscribe, all of that. But Wes, you also put up your own content and also the audio versions of these conversations on your own
Yes.
platform too. How can people find you?
Yeah, that's videogameacademia.org. There's a course page on there where I'll collect all of the audio as it releases. I try to spread it out so it releases like once a week or so on various whatever I guess podcast platforms you might use. Um, and and I put a few other things there too, like the text and screenshots that are handy to look back at on the Let's Play archive are on there, and then some other stuff too, but uh, mainly, I mean, at some point, I guess we'll be, you know, taking things from this to write up some sort of grand thesis or something about this game in kind of the way that we started to with Final Fantasy VII, and perhaps they will live on there at some point. But aside from that, I just do kind of random posts, essays, things that I've been reading, things that I've been playing, all kind of goes on to the Academy site. And Ben has a long piece on there about Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX from when he replayed them over the summer. And that's part of what kind of goaded me into like finally getting back toward toward this era of these games with you. So yeah.
And that's something maybe we can go more into detail with
Yeah.
at some point with our listeners. Like I could we can explain our backgrounds a little more, how we met at St. John's,
Mm.
how you've been a charter school teacher and now sort of a progressive school teacher across the West, in the Southwest, and now the Pacific Northwest, though closer to Idaho than to the coast, thus the snow. I could say a little bit about teaching at LSU and being a medievalist and studying Dante. But again, I have no idea how long anybody who's listening to this has been around with us. So maybe at some point, I'll just drop that stuff in the info just so that people know who we are. Um, that said, I hope that you're still enjoying Final Fantasy VIII after this most recent playthrough, making it through the training center,
Hmm.
being now assigned squad leader with Selphie and Zell,
That's right.
going to the Balam, going to Balam City, into the train station, going to the city of Timber, which seemed like a pretty cool city, but I didn't take very long to explore it and was almost immediately back onto another train car, which, as it turns out, is the hideout for these owls that I had to share a secret password with. Uh, just before that, to your point last time, another awkward exchange with the garden faculty present and Sid. There is some strange tension there between how they act and taking Zeldink's board and sort of what not magical but levitating skateboard,
Yeah.
hoverboard. There we are, hoverboard. Who hasn't seen Back to the Future from him? And so they're this oddly punitive force that seems to enforce all the rules, right? So like even
Yeah.
before the training simulation, they are the ones who are standing outside of the various corridors within Valum Garden. And then there's also Sid, who we find out, at least today when we meet Rinoa, that when he had a chance to personally talk to Rinoa, he took a personal interest in her cause for some reason. And so, yeah, he seems to have a different agenda from these functionaries in some way. And so there are parts of this game that are starting to already expand it a little bit, right? The presence of differing regions and the presence of this place, Galbadia, that we hear about different regions in the card game. But also during the dream sequence, we find out that there is something connecting Selfie, Zell, and Squall, or somebody trying to connect them with these other characters. And there's a strange ontological space where they occupy like voice bubbles, but they can't see each other, nor do they know that they're there. And they're offering commentary on these characters who are equipped with their GFs and
Yes.
and abilities. And Selfie says, we can't even get into this yet. And then of course we meet Laguna and Julia for the first time, the parents of, I believe, one the parent of Rinoa, who we just meet, and one the parent of Squall. In fact, the song that she's playing, Eyes on Me by Fei Wong, is actually playing when Rinoa and Squall meet, which I thought was a nice touch.
Ah.
The sort of strange now looking back on it, they are almost an incestuous pair, but not quite. Because their parents did sort of fall in love and almost become parents to, I guess, two other or some other sort of kids in a different sort of future where time compression happens, but they get pulled away by time and necessity, which is perhaps what Ultimesha and is ultimately trying to fight against. But we'll have to see. I'm getting way ahead of the game by saying that.
Yeah, we don't know any of that within the game yet.
No,
Well,
no,
yeah,
no,
about the
not
time.
ultimate. And we won't find out about her until, well, we'll see what we find out about her. But in any case, we're on this train. We finally meet Rinoa after having had this strange dream sequence that's completely unexplained. It takes us into the Galbadian military, who have so far been the antagonists
Right.
to us. They are clearly the antagonists with Timber because they attacked them 18 years ago, and this is perhaps part of that attack 18 years ago when Timber had a mighty force, fighting force, and also they were the antagonists at the communications tower during the seed testing, and so this is an interesting sort of insight into them. But then I got to where we're hatching the first mission in that very annoying side quest where you have to maneuver the train cars in this way or another. And that was when it was time to take a break and come podcast with you.
Okay.
So I apologize for the overlong summary.
That's okay.
But is that about how far you got? And well, where would you
Yeah.
like to begin today?
Yeah. No, yeah, I had done the end of the evening sequence in the training center last time, so we already kind of touched on that with Quistis and Squall. And then I played through this time the whole of the mission with the train coupling, uncoupling stuff. It then allows you to explore Timber finally. And so I've been just kind of starting to do that, and I saved at the first save point that I found in the back alley, which I think is pretty close to the TV station. I'm not entirely sure. That seems to be like the goal is to get to the TV station for some reason. Um, I'm I I don't fully follow, yeah, like what's going on plot wise at this point, other than um, it sounds like Rinoa has hired these 3 seeds, right? These newly minted seeds, and their contract is with her organization, the Owls, and they they want to kidnap the president of Galbadia, whose name is also Dealing or Delling, which is the city that the dream sequence takes place in, actually, right? It's like, I guess, the capital of Galbadia, Delling City. So there's something um, that's kind of hinted at there about the uh, this like the thing that might be tying, right, the dream sequence to the present. Um, it could very well have a political quality to it as well. But in terms of what we actually have seen, it's definitely the love story thing, right? And um, Rinoa's um, interestingly keeps mentioning Seifer also. So as you are kind of uh, playing the role of Squall, his character, he seems to be uh, impossible to touch in any kind of emotional way, right? He's uh, not exactly all business. Um, he's maybe a little bit even too aloof to do that. But he definitely wants to uh, perform well and prove himself. And the only thing so far that has seemed to, you know, throw him off is this idea that Rinoa might be interested in Seifer. That that is like hinted at by her and by the other owls, and it's certainly um, the dream sequence bringing this kind of romance to the forefront of the characterization so far. Um, Now, I think the dream sequence is particularly strange because it involves our characters having these manifestations as Galbadian soldiers, but also the like the progress of the story is like totally interrupted, right? Um, and there's really very little uh, you know, gameplay per se in this part. You pretty much can't explore anywhere. You basically are fighting like incredibly weak opponents, so there's really no tension in that sense. It's purely on the focus purely on the dialogue, right, between Laguna and Julia, the piano player that he's been crushing on for a while, it sounds like. Um, and so I I don't think that there's really a lot of choice that you have in that regard either, right? You're just kind of clicking through the dialogue. But as you mentioned, you do see the ways that the characters up to this point are like observing and commenting on the characters that we're playing as during the time that they're asleep on the train. Uh, so it's very mysterious, it's very interesting. Um, like I said, I remember really liking these parts of the game. Um, and I I think it was just because it is such a strange like digression from a game that I otherwise was not very interested in to start with. So
Well, it is a strange digression, just what happens during the
yeah.
course of it. So, in the actual Maison song, the narrative itself, these three, as you said, newly minted seeds on their very first mission are going on this low stakes, low pay mission to help one of the many upstart groups that
Mhm.
are attempting to create revolution in timber and to free it. So you have these young, sort of gung ho, eager, like you said again, to prove themselves seeds who then fall asleep and watch these regular soldiers. So they're special forces and mercenaries, or at least that's how Squall describes himself when the owl leader wants him to go run an errand for him. He's like, what are we here to do? Exactly, zone. And then we have our ward character there. So we have our Sid and our ward. Um, but then Laguna so these three Galbadian soldiers don't wear helmets, unlike all the
Yeah.
other ones with those three-eye sort of interesting Game of Thrones three-eye raven sort of get-ups. And they are sneaking off of the battlefield to get into a car and go to the dealing capital city and go have a drink. And what is it? Kuros and Ward are the names of his friends, right?
Right. The big guy's Ward, and the small fast guy is Kiros.
Yes, and Ward, I guess they're naval officers or naval enlisted people because he fights with a ship's anchor, I think, or a harpoon.
Yeah.
I think. Um, and then Kuros with the two sort of blades, and then Laguna just has a gun.
All right.
Which perhaps is supposed to be a reference to Squall in some way or another with his gun blade, but maybe
Right.
not as well. But they're sneaking off to the city to have a drink, not to get sloshed, like Ward says. And as Kiro suggests, and there's apparently something they've done a lot because there's a usual table for Laguna, and when he finally talks to Julia, it turns out that she spent a lot of time observing him. Apparently, he smiled at her many, many, many times, many, many, many nights. And then one of those moments that I think makes Final Fantasy charming, that Final Fantasy VII did very well, is those moments of comic relief where Julia says that she'd like to talk to Laguna in her room because they don't have any privacy, and then the camera zooms out, and you can see that everybody from the space is basically right around them listening, and including Kuros and Ward, who had said that they had to go. And the two Galbadian infantry guys, one is an officer, and even the bartender, I think, is
Right. They're all there. Yeah.
But this is
Well, and and the ghosts or whatever, metaphysical quality the listening seeds have too, right? They're also listening.
they're
with us,
right.
yeah.
So that ontology is interesting in itself, but so this is a very interesting intermezzo sequence to have. Look, we are very much like the seeds, right? We are new to this game. We are ready to get out of school and to finally get to it. And this is a moment that I think is both Homeric and Quixotic, like Don Quixote and like Homer. What do I mean? Homer is famous for throwing these huge similes, the Homeric similes, in the middle of battles that function not only to add poetic pathos to particular characters by characterizing them as like a dying bull or like a flower that's turned over, but they also put a stop in the middle of this super gripping action. You have to sit there and read this simile about a boar or a flower for several lines before you get back to the action. Right. And so we're champing at the bit to finally fight. And then we're confronted with these slightly older characters than the ones that we're controlling, these late high schoolers who are getting out of their responsibilities, that are going to engage in leisure, that are in some ways like a prefiguration of the next stage of life. Not to be cynical about that being young is trying to get into work, whereas being middle-aged is trying to get out of work. But not only is it strange in that it makes us pause on the action, makes us see the world as bigger than in fact it actually is. This is what the game is inviting us to do, I think, to actually take a second to reflect, but we don't want to reflect. And so it seems like it would make more sense if the dream sequence were more in line with the dreamers themselves and the place that they occupy in their or are at in their lives, but it doesn't. Or if it does, and I think it does, and we will see along the road how it does, that it's again in a way that we could not expect given the pieces that we currently see in the puzzle, but that it is supposed to be puzzling is bizarre. And like, are they dreaming this? Are they worried about this? Is this some Freudian thing? How are all three of them connected? It's very strange that it just happens. It has bizarre content in it that again smacks of this love story that is again maybe overdone in this Final Fantasy VIII. And then we're just supposed to just move on. It's almost like it's making fun of a certain sort of gamer that just keeps moving forward without ever asking what's happening in the story itself. But okay, so the second bit, the quixotic bit that I wanted to mention about that. So that's the Homeric bit, that delaying gratification, or sorry, delaying the action, starting a sequence and then putting something in the middle that delays the denouement. But the Don Quixote bit is, I think, in the beginning, the first part of Don Quixote, there's a real question of, will any of the sequences ever, or episodes, ever connect together, and will anything in a more traditionally narrative, will a more traditional plot emerge that, or will just a bunch of random things continue to happen in this text because it's attempting to mimic a real life with this sort of realistic technique. But eventually it takes off. I think to some extent that's also kind of like a human life. When one is young and one is trying to do things, one fails so frequently. One wants to make something of oneself, one doesn't know how to practice or train, or how long it takes even to make, a meal. And so I feel I feel the sense from the characters like Squall that they are trying to feel like real seeds, that they like Don Quixote wants to be a real knight. They really want a mission to justify themselves, but then the mission is so disappointing, and this organization they're working with is so disappointing. And to some extent, I think that's something like what happens when you first take on a professional role, like being a teacher. When you first enter into your first classroom, you think you're going to be better than the teachers on television and make a more immediate impact. And then it turns out that, well, actually teaching is much more difficult than that. And you have to be a little bit more subdued in your expectations, or just mature in your expectations. But this is a quixotic moment. This is not the sort, not only is this revolutionary group not organized, but they don't even identify the right target, right? So even this president that they're trying to attack, it turns out that they're kind of a joke, because this is just a disguised president, or a president in disguise. An imposter. And so they do not, at least in the perception of Squall, who I think lets Rinoa have it a little bit, have their stuff together, to not use the pejorative. And so in this moment, I think that the work is very quixotic, and that there are these interesting threads that are going through, but it's unclear what the unifying whole is going to be, and whether our characters are in fact going to get picked up into a large cosmos-defining, world-defending, time-destroying sort of an adventure, right? It's like, how are they going to get from here to there? Which is, I think, part of the amazing scope of these games. Not only is it hard to imagine going from level 15 to 100 and doing like 170 damage to like 70,000 damage, but just like, I can't even imagine my character at this point, who can't even stay awake on a train and is having these weird epileptic or somnolent fits, getting to like epic hero status, and also dealing with the pettiness with Sifa. But also Homeric, in that we are made to wait. And this is a convention I think that you noticed last time that happens over and over with the tutorials. I'm going to add to my hypothesis 3 last time, that I think people don't like this game because of all the tutorials. They come one after another, and the fighting system, as useful and interesting as it is, and as much as it rewards you for using the junctioning system intelligently and not just leveling up. I'm running away from lots of battles right now, by the way, so I don't get too strong. I think that this game slows one down a lot at the beginning, and so again, one has this Homeric desire to now that one is in the action, get just to and through the action, and also this Quixotic Don Quixote sort of aspect of, can we please get to the thing that matters now?
Yeah. 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 It well, so the train sequence is yet another really strange version of that, right? Because yeah, it sets it up like, oh, you're gonna kidnap the president. That's gonna be a big deal. But there aren't traditional battles during this part. There's no exploration at all. Um, you're literally on rails, right? And you just have to sort of follow a very precise series of instructions that Rinoa is throwing out at you to like push the right buttons in the right order and avoid the guards and this and that. Um, it's kind of ludicrous. And then, right, it's a imposter for the president. So there's this kind of letdown in that regard. He's also one of those bosses that can be taken out in one shot because he's an undead or a zombie type enemy. I don't know if they really make that super clear. He does seem to have some sort of mutated thing going on, and he uses a lot of status effect type attacks on your party. Um, it's not a difficult battle, I wouldn't say, but it again is like not a typical battle either. It's not like you're going to overpower him with strength. You can actually very easily just throw a phoenix down at him and he dies. So it's kind of up to you how you want to, interpret that. But it definitely seems to be saying something about the nature of the enemy, right? They didn't do what we were expecting in Dalet City, where they went up to the communication tower, right? And now they're doing something again unexpected, and even further, like they have foreseen what the rebels are going to try. They have acted to prevent that from working and seem to be kind of playing cat and mouse actually with the owls, right? There's there's a really interesting series of things that point back in time here. We know that communications towers haven't been used in about 20 years. We know that it's about 20 years since Timber was taken over, and the original leaders, the parents of Watts and Zone, were publicly executed, right? And the president himself apparently like took the gun from a soldier nearby and shot the dead bodies just to, assert his power and his brutality. Um, we also know that the Sorceress War, at least one of them, maybe it's like the third or something, ended around that time, right? And so there's like all these hints that something really important changed about the time that these characters would have been almost born, maybe, right? Or something. Um, so uh, the timing of everything has been important all throughout, right? The kind of timer keeps showing up on the screen, like counting down to things, uh, and and of course the timer for your game as a whole is constantly counting up to like make you aware of just how long you're spending in this world, right? There's certain things that actually do depend on that, as you'll discover if you care about playing cards enough, right? There's the RNG for certain things that have to do with the card games and probably enemy encounters and stuff like that too. But definitely for the card games, if you can like reset the RNG in certain ways, based on like how much time has ticked since you last saved or started the game or fought a battle or this or that, you can get things to happen in the card games that makes the going a lot smoother. So I'm reading up on all that stuff, and it's just really I think it's just really interesting how uh, you know all of the things you were saying about um, our party wanting to progress and yet being forced or shunted by the way the story is being told. Uh, that they must not, that they must do this other thing, this kind of flowery, poetic thing, maybe, right? Um, and that they might want to have a kind of coherence to their story, which the game again is resisting so far, at least, right? It's throwing out this, it's throwing out that. We have more and more characters being introduced who seem you know, maybe kind of important, but also kind of silly, right? Laguna has like a leg cramp when he's up there trying to talk to Julia on the stage, and then this character, I think it's Zone, right, who keeps getting the stomach aches and he
Yes.
like can't function, but he just like cares so much about their mission. Watts, you know, similarly, yeah, just like wants to test Squall, I guess, by sending him to the princess, right, to wake her up. And everyone seems to think, oh, she's gonna like, you know, freak out when he wakes her up and she's gonna beat him up or something, right? But it of course they know each other already. She's happy to see him. So there's a lot of really strange things, yes, with time that are both like plot and gameplay uh, that are all, you know, kind of interconnected here. Um,
I
yeah.
really love that point because obviously we will realize, or we will soon be touching on the sort of ultimate evil plot of
Mhm.
the ultimate antagonist at some point here will involve time. And so there is something very important about time. And you pinpointing that I think is really interesting. A thought that I just had that I wanted to just intersperse into this conversation, and maybe you can help me make the bridge a little better than I have so far, is that these fairy tale elements, which we would expect from a Final Fantasy VII, though we talked about how the name is perhaps subverted by the complexity of the game itself, or the genre is at least subverted, that good and evil are not as obvious as one might seem. And we're starting to get a little bit of that, right? We've taken our enemies' shoes and the complex relationships between these people and the fact that we're mercenaries, but we're a mercenary that has a personal connection to Rinoa. I think you may have noticed that Squall makes his first joke, I believe, to her. Talks about needing to dance on missions and that
Ah, that's right.
bunch of skills. He's obviously joking there because he doesn't know how to dance. She says, "Oh, it's for work then." And he goes dot dot dot. It's like that was him trying to be cool. But
That's right.
we have these fairy tale elements now come in. There's a princess. There were these sorceresses who had a war. We'll soon learn that there's a concept of a knight.
Mm.
And also, you know, she's like what? Sleeping Beauty when we come upon her, and she has a dog named Angelo and these angel wings
Oh
on
yeah.
her back. And so I guess in a sort of Freudian Peter Pan sort of way, you might say that, or Sleeping Beauty, there may be like a coming of age, coming to consciousness element, coming to consciousness of one's place in the world and one's responsibility and the consequences of one's actions that neither of these people or parts of these organizations have yet faced, even though one is a rebel group and one is a mercenary group. They're young people and they're not yet mature. And so perhaps some of these fairy tale elements in their like princess, sorcerer, or sorceress in this case, because they all are female, and sort of like Dune, the Bene Gesserit, right?
Mhm.
Um, uh, that that part of why the fairy tale motifs are in here are the elements of fairy tales that are Bildungsroman that emphasize the development of consciousness from, say, an adolescent to a mature person, which, like you said about time, 18 years ago is when the Galbadian army invaded Timber. So
That's
these
right.
characters are under 18 years old that we're with. And to your point about Laguna, again, we're getting his cramp. Utterly uncool. These characters care about being cool. I think, again, adding to my hypothesis three, I guess it's three sub C right now, is that all of these characters are really cool looking. Even
Mhm.
they're very highly stylized, and they have very highly stylized outfits. And what's interesting about that is they're like steroid users or something like that, and that they're still very childish in their mentalities, but they're, you know, they're extraordinarily attractive in their worlds with like these amazing powers and physiques, and yet they still like eat hot stuffed hot dogs in their faces in the case of Zell or whatever. But that just to return to the fairy tale point, that part of what I think Final Fantasy's attempts to do in teaching one the complexity of questions of good and evil and the complexity of one's relationships to those around one in the world, and perhaps even subverting the initial expectations of those relationships, like employer and employed. Um, you know, what's going to be more important between between Cloud and Tifa? the fact that he's a part of Avalanche or their personal relationship in Final Fantasy VII? What's going to end up being more important between Rinoa and Squall? The fact that he's this mercenary that's been hired by a group that she's passionate about helping the out. As might be suggested by the fact that she had sort of that relationship with Seifer at some point. And so the game seems to be subverting our expectations about the nature even of the importance of certain relationships. One thing I want to add to that is that as Squall is running down the corridor to go to his first mission, there are three girl students, female students talking, and they're wondering about whether they'll still be friends after graduation. And I think that's very interesting plot point when you think about time and period of time and the changes that are consequent upon time, because I think everybody knows that to some extent friendships so they can endure, of course, but they also seem to be fluid to certain situations because you find yourself around and then not around certain people. And so interesting to see that commented on, then find these three characters who seem to share the same dream in some way, but are utterly disconnected. And then have this protagonist character, Squall, who even when he talks to Quistis and she's bearing her soul to him, and he seems to have a chance to make out with her like these other people there. And that, I mean, you know, a lot of people seem to be fans of Quistis Treppy, so whatever. He says he doesn't want to bear any other people's problems. So just to finally bring this back, perhaps part of the buildings room and part of Final Fantasy, part of the fairy tale elements will be that Squall will have to learn about the nature of relationships, and that they are not simply as simple or as straightforward as he would think and like to think as a mercenary, right? The great thing about being a mercenary, whether you're Cloud or Squall, is you get to be dispassionate. You know, you're sort of like a Jedi. You get to not care and get involved with the people that you're fighting alongside. And I don't think Final Fantasy VIII is going to allow us to get away with that simplistic understanding of human relationship.
Yeah, I mean the way that the friendships are portrayed so far is kind of suggestive, right? Like we have two really outgoing, really energetic characters in Zell and Selphie. And then we have Squall, right? Who's like defined by his inability to connect with others and his apparent like lack of interest in that. We have Quistis, who's like more mature and seems to have not really shown who she really is so far because she's been in this kind of professional role. And her attempt to do that, Squall closes off, right? So we don't really get to see what that might be. And she's not exactly a party member yet. Like she's still shows up in the party, but she's always grayed out. She's not on this mission. Then there's Rinoa, right? Another very outgoing, very powerful sort of personality. And one that is very prone to be idealized, right? Because we again don't actually know her yet. But all of the indicators, like you mentioned, the iconography that goes with her, the dream sequences, and everything, it suggests that she is that kind of ideal girlfriend for Squall, right? And then you have the dream characters who seem to know each other really well, right? They're veteran soldiers, or at least have been in battle before. They aren't particularly serious about fighting, but they are super powerful compared to all of the Galbadian soldiers that we've seen so far, right? Because they have our abilities, our party's abilities, and they seem to have like some backstories where they, they tell Laguna like you just talk too much, like just ask her about herself, man. They want to support him, like, but he's so nervous, he's so like in his own head. And he wants to be a writer, the way that she wants to be a singer. So they have these kind of like ambitions that are beyond the scope of like complete this mission, complete this game, as the case may be, right? They want to like do artistic things, which is pretty remarkable, and doesn't at all fit into like the way that the game is actually structured. as a Final Fantasy game, right? So there's something kind of weird going on there about well, I mean, and you see this too once you start to explore Timber. One of the places you have to go is the Timber Maniacs, which is like the newspaper, and there's like all these stacks of books and things, and the people in there are just like talking about the good old days, you know. There's this kind of like retrospective quality, and they're like, man, you know, people used to read stuff, and I got into this because I wanted to write stuff, but now all that we sell is like, you know, pulp fiction and these terrible like battle books, you know, everything's battle series. And you talk to the editor in the back, and he's like incapable of listening to your weird story about the dream on the train. He just like starts spouting off about his dreams, you know, and like when I was a kid, you know, youth and blah blah. And Squall, like, you literally stop listening to him, and it goes just back into Squall's head being like, man, why did I even ask him? Like, adults are terrible. They don't listen. So it's really funny that the whole thing about, yeah, friendship, relationships, how that relates to the self and maturity, and then some stuff about like youth and old age, you know, or at least middle age, like the differing like values, you know, and maybe incommensurable and incommunicable values that the characters have. So so it's pretty cool once you stop expecting it to be Final Fantasy VII. Yeah.
Yes, no, but that was always the bugbear of it. That's the nice
Yeah.
thing about playing it now, that it doesn't have to be as, I think, yeah, again, one of the problems is it wasn't as earth-shattering as the second installment on the PS1,
Yeah.
as the first. It would be like if they were on Mario 64 too. It would be very hard for it to have the same impact as the original Mario 64. But like you said, this game has elements of, I mean, high artistic value, maybe genius, in that it keeps reiterating its theme and putting it in front of you over and over again. So, like you said, like you mentioned that you actually have a salary in this game, and it turns out that I was seed level 4, you're seed level 7, so I was bad.
Ooh, I'm making money, man.
I'm a bad tester. I'm a bad test taker. What can I say? No,
It's okay.
like Seifer.
Not that bad.
If you would have, if they had the appropriate individualized learning plans at Balam Garden, Seifer would be a seed.
That's right. That's
But
right.
like you said, there are these periodized moments within the in-game time when you get your salary. So there's a constant reminder of the passage of time, besides the ever-present game clock in the stats menu. The game does cyclical things like that, with you, just reminding you that time is passing and that time is in some way important, in the same way that it's thrust us into the past, and also shown us now for the second time this Elone or Elone character, whose name we may have seen but don't know, can be attributed to this woman with brown hair and what, like a blue shawl and like a green scarf thing over her, who was overlooking Squall during his injury and his convalescence, before the doctor came in, and then now was in this training center and was being accosted by a giant bug thing, monster. But right, I think that is really interesting how this game does touch on its theme over and over again, but unless you're really looking, it's hard to see how it connects together, and it can seem like there's just a bit much. And maybe adding this to Hypothesis 3 sub D, there is so much in this game. Like we said about having to use a strategy guide, it is amazing how much one can miss without knowing certain things about cards and certain things about which characters you need to draw from, and how quick, if you build certain skills in the GF and then you junction certain things, how quickly you can make a change, or how much more effective your characters can become in battle, by even now, I'm sure, if we were really crazy about how we play, but that the world is almost too rich to understand, and there might be sort of a natural FOMO to it, and that it's we. I think a certain class of player might almost not like it because whereas one class might love that there's so much detail and so much that can be done and so many interesting things that are part of it, another part might think that that is an illegitimate way of making a game because how could certain of these secrets be discovered?
Right.
Um, and that upsets the ethical framework of a certain sort of player. Um, because this is a criticism that I once saw in a movie making fun of various detective novels written by different authors where they use different conceits to reveal what was happening, uh, how they discovered the criminal at the end, and one was renowned for just bringing up a piece of evidence that was never mentioned in the novel prior, and so
Yeah.
well one one wonders with certain of those details in Final Fantasy VIII, like how could you possibly know that during the seed test, if you talk to any NPCs, which is usually a good thing, that that's now been subverted due to this time limit, and now you're going to lose, points on the test, and then have a lower seed ranking, and then make less money.
Yeah.
So I guess just putting it like that, this game makes you conscious, if you think of it, of the ripple effects of your decisions through time. Because right now I'm making less money every time I get
Mhm.
my salary than you are because of the decisions that you made, where you, as a more intelligent RPG player, played the specific game, whereas I, as a more generalized RPG player, just played an RPG.
Mm.
And instead of, in the same way that I guess our expectations of good and evil are subverted, certain of the gameplay mechanics, like Earthbound, right?
Mhm.
Where how you interact with the world is you have to like continually press A, but then there's another button you can press that actually makes a lot of interactions easier if you're smart about it. I haven't played it as much as you, but I think that that is the case.
Mhm.
But that um, it subverts over and over again how one expects the genre to work, and that again, even even the seed ranking and the money you get is an indication of the fact that your decisions within the game do have do have value and do resonate. And that I think is a it was a almost unique step along the RPG trajectory towards like the more open world concept, which we've talked about in the past, was really the ideal for a long time. Like I think when in the 1990s, late 90s, the concept of having a world where you could go into all the buildings and just sort of live there seemed really cool. I think at this point now we know that there's certain limitations to it, and maybe it doesn't need to be fully open world, though there are, there is like Minecraft like that. But
Mhm.
now we kind of have that. And it's like just don't waste your whole life in it. But back
Yeah.
then we were still working towards that. And Final Fantasy VIII, I think, does, at least so far, pretty good job of giving one the feeling that in-game choices do actually change the outcome of the game to some extent. That do change the play of the game, that do have an impact on the game.
Yeah. And certainly uh the I don't know if choices necessarily or like the lack of awareness that you have a choice. If you see what I'm saying, right? Like if you assume that you want to level up because this is an RPG, then that default approach is going to lead to really difficult battles later on if you don't also understand how to, yeah, figure out your strategy with junctioning spells and all that stuff. And certainly the way that the card game allows you to very early on uh, acquire some crazy items and spells, that is, yeah, less a choice and more a like I would say it's really the choice is whether you, yeah, look at somebody else's advice about the game, um, or you just kind of play it on your own because there's really no indication so far that cards are that important of a thing. Like, you do meet this character called the Queen of Cards. She actually turns out to not have any important cards right now. And again, the thing you're supposed to do apparently is lose one of your best cards to her in order for her to begin this process that will allow you to get a better card later or something, right? So I mean, it's entirely just a just a well hidden secret, right? It's like something that adds to the depth of the game if you choose to try to dig into it. Um, but you can very well um, not even realize that that's a choice, right? You just can completely. Um, there's a there's a few boss battles that give you cards, right? When you fight Ifrit, you get his card. When you fight Diablos from the Magic Lamp, you get his card. And
First time.
then there's like a random card that you pick up here in Timber when you fight a couple of soldiers. They've apparently like stolen this card from a drunk in the bar. And so then you bring his card back to him and he gives you a better one for it. So there's like a few instances of cards kind of popping up. But otherwise you have to search it out. You have to seek it out. And is it's very arcane. It's very like fiddly. Yeah.
You know, before we go, because I know we didn't, interestingly enough, we didn't have the largest chunk to talk about, but I do think that um it really is an intermezzo set piece in so many ways. Not only do we have this liminal, subliminal dream space that we enter into in the middle of the first mission, it's while we're on a literal transport. We're on a train that's going intercontinental underneath the water. So like
Mhm.
literally we go into the depths. And Jungian suggests that bodies of water, particularly the ocean, can be representations of the unconscious and the deep unconscious, not just the personal unconscious, the ocean's deep. But then we have a dream sequence down there while on this transport, like in Spirited Away, what Jihiro with these spirits of the dead goes on. And so this is very much an influx. We're away from home. We're away from the garden. We as seeds are being cast into the world. And again, it may not yet feel real in this early Quixote way, but it is real. Things are happening. We are learning, and we don't know the importance of what we're learning yet. You know some of the importance because you played this. You're wisely seeking accompaniment with the strategy guide, but a lot of what you say is actually news to me, even though I played this game with a strategy guide so many years ago. I have not yet started to look at it, and I'll tell you why. It's not from an ethical reason so much as a Schrodinger's cat sort of reason. Once I look at it and realize everything I'm missing, it will create a sense of necessity in me, where I'll feel an imperative to play better. So in some extent, it's why somebody might not want to go get those X-rays of that MRI that shows that they have cancer, right? Because they know that they're going to have to change their lives once they have that new information. And so once I see the strategy guide, I'm like, oh my God, because that is one thing about this game. Add this to sub-hypothesis E, it gets really, really hard.
Yes.
Eventually. And that you don't have any indication that it's going to be so hard. Like you're like, okay, there are all these crazy tutorials and there seem to be a bunch of things you can do with GFs. But I remember that when I first played it, and this is something that just came to me this week, and I just remember this, I had to quit my first save. I think around Adele, because I was just too weak. I'd missed too many GFs. I'd missed too many multipliers to really make it happen. And I wasn't going to get my ultimate items and nowhere close. And I don't know if I even had Renzo Kukin, the ultimate limit break. But when I played the game again the second time with a much greater understanding of junctioning and the importance of cards as well, I ended up with the Leonhardt, and I messed Ultimacia up at the end. So that is another thing about this game these indications early on really are indications of potential trouble as well, because the
Mhm.
game, like you said, this like Final Fantasy Tactics, you can find yourself in a situation where it's sort of like a soft lock. You might
Yeah.
not be able to. I mean, probably you could progress, but the thing is, even just fighting random battles gets difficult the higher your level is. And so the way to progress is, again, not in the linear, straightforward default RPG way, and there will be consequences. There are major consequences to playing in the way that I play right now. I do have a basic understanding of junctioning. I am working and I already have magic junction to various aspects of my character's magic, strength, and such.
Mhm.
And but I better get that strategy guide soon, because right, this is a game that I think punishes you for not having the strategy guide and rewards you for having it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, you got to start playing cards. That's crucial.
Yeah,
That's
I need to
everything.
do that too. But yeah, right. My cards are so bad that after losing those first couple times, that yeah, I'm like any bad loser, right? You lose once or twice and you just decide that you're going to quit. And
Mhm.
that's true defeat. Um, Okay, well, Wes, is there anything, any final note that we should end on before moving out of our own dream sequence back from this intermezzo into our?
Hmm. Uh, I think I would just point out that uh, the thing about GFs that I didn't notice before this um, is that they are very similar to pets. This is a weird thing, right? But like um, we see that Rinoa has this dog, and the dog is her limit break, right? It can do things. And there's this pet shop there in Timber, and you can buy some stuff at the pet shop, but it sells stuff that impacts your GFs. So not only are GFs kind of like monsters in some ways, and also kind of like cards in some ways, and they seem to be really important for your characters having all the powers that they do have, right? But there's an amnesia piece there. They're also in some way like animal companions. And I think that is really uh fun to think about. Um, in terms of naming characters, you can name Squall, you can name Rinoa, and you can name her dog, and then you can name all of the GFs, and that's it. So there's a weird, like, I don't know, there's some kind of strange um, interplay there, uh, kind of like the way that we seem to have this mental link with these people in the dream. There's definitely a kind of relationship there with these forces of nature or whatever they are. Um, yeah, yeah, and it makes me think also about you know the idea of animal familiars, right? So familiar spirits, this kind of idea with witches having their cats or whatever it might be. But this, of course, comes up in a really big way in Philip Pullman's books too, which is something that was really formative for me at that time. Um, so I don't know exactly, what's going on with that. Again, no one seems to be that interested in GFs except for the seeds, um, which is bizarre. But anyway, uh, that little connection is something to watch for.
Well, I think that's fantastic, and I'm glad that the listeners now have a little reminder of how to find you
Yes.
and your Video Game Academy site, where and also they should subscribe to your newsletter, which you send out, which is those are essays in of themselves and
Yeah.
excellent. Um, and well, looking forward to getting to do this next week and continuing down another side quest and hopefully providing more hidden gems
Right
for
on.
whatever we set on the algorithm. It worked for someone. So that's
Somebody
great.
found it. That's cool.
All
Love it. Thanks
right.
again.
Well, yeah. See you again in a week for another side quest, my friend.
Okay, take care.